So it's 5 o'clock. Let's begin. Hello, everybody. Welcome at the Munich School of Politics and Public Policy to our today's event. We are very pleased and excited that you are interested in what we planned for today, the lecture of Dipesh Chakrabarty about the planet and the political. This talk today is kind of the climax of a project on planetary political theory that we set up this winter semester at the Professorship for Political Philosophy and Theory. This little small project consisted, first of all, of the discussion of Dipesh Chakrabarty's latest book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, in our research colloquium. The book is to be published in German by Surkamp in April this year. Secondly, we conducted an interview with Dipesh some weeks ago on the book's thesis and the importance of a planetary perspective for social sciences and humanities. This interview will appear in the Journal of Political Theory and in part in a collection we are currently organizing on post-colonial understandings of the state. Then, within this project, there will be a debate we are organizing in the German Political Science Quarterly, in which experts on political and social sciences will address the meaning of the planetary for politics and the political. And finally, today's lecture, in which Dipesh will present his central theses and put them up for discussion. I will therefore not say much in terms of content, but go straight into the organization of tonight's event before handing over the floor to our speaker. Following Dipesh's talk, which is expected to last about 45 minutes, Miranda Schreurs will comment on it. Miranda holds the Professorship of Environment and Climate Policy at the Munich School of Politics and Public Policy. She is a recognized expert on international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low-carbon energy transitions. She's involved in projects examining the energy transitions in Germany and Japan, climate policies of Europe, the United States, and China, and the politics of high-level radioactive waste disposal. In 2011, Miranda was appointed by Chancellor Merkel as a member of the German Ethics Commission on a Safe Energy Supply. And from 2008 until 2016, she served as member of the German Advisory Council on the Environment and is vice chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Council. Miranda has researched and taught at various Japanese universities and for a period of 3 years conducted research at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, supported by a grant awarded by the MacArthur Foundation. She was a tenured associate professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park, before becoming director of the Environmental Policy Research Center and professor of comparative politics at the Freie Universität Berlin in 2007. Miranda, thank you very much for your commitment and your contribution. Following Miranda, Christina Pauls and Nicki Weber will also briefly comment on Dipesh's talk, and Nicki will present the commentary. Nicki is a research assistant at the Professorship for Political Philosophy and Theory with a focus on post-colonial theory. In his diploma thesis, Black Subjectification and Subjectifying Recognition, he approached Afro-German perspectives on recognition vis-à-vis theories of Frantz Fanon and Judith Butler. In addition to his academic work, he is active in political education, and in his dissertation project, Nicki works on political and philosophical conceptions between European existentialism and Black existentialism with a critical emphasis on liberalism. Christina Pauls has studied governance and public policy in Passau and Kigali and peace studies in Innsbruck. For more than 10 years, she has engaged with questions of peace and justice and understands herself as researcher activist. Besides teaching and researching at the TUM School of Social Sciences and Technology, she also regularly conducts workshops on topics of global learning for youth and adults. Other influences on her thinking workings are in the Central African country of Rwanda, where she has lived, worked, and studied for over 3 years. In her dissertation project, Christina works on the coloniality of peace and approaches inspired by postmodern and transrational peace philosophy in combination with decolonial perspectives a philosophical imagination of pieces otherwise. Christina and Nicki, thank you both as well for your input today. Now, following these two comments after Dipesh's talk, we will then give Dipesh another opportunity to respond and then open the discussion, which we invite and encourage you all to attend. But now, finally, to our guest and keynote speaker this evening, Dipesh Chakrabarty is the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. At least since the publication of Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Differences in 2000, Dipesh has been considered one of the world's leading experts in the fields of modern South Asian history and historiography, post-colonial studies and theory and history of globalization, and for the last decades also in the field of climate change. Dipesh worked out the extent to which the history of India, but also of other former colonies, continues to be dominated by European discourses. Therefore, central concepts of the European Enlightenment must not be misunderstood as universal and objective or even neutral, but rather it is necessary to understand Europe as a cultural province in a heterogeneous world in order to break up existing power relations and to expose the contradictions and the violence in the history of modernity. Now, in his latest book, Dipesh argues that climate change upends long-standing ideas of history, modernity, and globalization. The aim of the climate of history in a planetary age is therefore to understand what this means and to confront humanities with ideas they have been reluctant to reconsider, from the changed nature of human agency to new acceptance of universals. Dipesh argues that in the age of the Anthropocene, we must see ourselves from two perspectives at once, the planetary and the global. This distinction is central to his work, the globe as a human-centric construction and the planetary, which intentionally decenters the human. Dipesh, we thank you and look forward to your presentation today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Martin. Is this volume okay?
It's okay.
So thank you for the invitation to give this lecture. I'm very honored and also very glad to get an opportunity to explain my work a little bit before the book comes out in German. And the book's already had some reviews in German, and I noticed some, what in my view are misreadings. So I will take this opportunity also to clarify the central distinction in the book that you mentioned, Martin, which is between the globe and the planet, and how I got to it. So I'll try to speak for not more than 45 minutes. I'm setting the timer to go for 45 minutes. And when my 45 minutes are up, I might just stop and try to say the rest of it during the Q&A and the discussion. So if everything doesn't get clarified in the 45 minutes, no worries, we'll have time to clarify them later. So it's also an honor to speak in front of Miranda, who is such a distinguished policy person. And I must say that, see, I'm not, so what is the capacity in which I wrote this book, in which I began to think about climate change? So I have to say that I got interested in it as a historian of modernity, colonization, globalization, empires. And one of the reasons why I got interested was because I thought climate change and the science behind it, but particularly Earth system science, threw some profound challenges to my discipline. So the question really for me was, okay, if this is a problem, a multidimensional problem that humans face throughout the world, and if it is a problem that different disciplines approach differently, what does this problem do to my discipline? So that was one of the questions, or one of the points of view from which I began to write. And the second point of view from which I also began to think and write was that of a humanist. So, in the book, in the introduction, I mention Kant's 4 questions in his introduction to logic, where he says, if you have a problem, then are initially 3 dimensions to it. You ask, what is the problem? And climate change is a problem that's been defined by scientists. It is really Earth system scientists or scientists of climate who defined a planetary problem for us. There could be other explanations of climate change, there could be other meanings of climate change, but I begin from the proposition that when you ask what is the problem, you go and read the science, at least initially. Or you can't do without reading the science to understand what the problem is. The second question Kant asks is, what should we do about it? And there I say, again, read the scientists, read technologists, read policy people, read activists, because they're the people who are actually talking about what we should do about it. My book is not what we should do about it. As a citizen, I have ideas about what people should do about it, but not as an academic historian thinking through the challenge of climate change. I thought that was not where I had interesting things to offer. Others do. Secondly, Kant says, what do we expect from this problem? And he says, go to religion, go to art. And I would say the same thing, that actually how to cope with climate change or what to expect, how to visualize what climate change means. I mean, there's not only artistic interventions, even one could argue that IPCC's projections on a visual scale of what the world might be like if the average warming was more than 4 degrees Celsius. You have a World Bank video on YouTube, which is about what might happen if the warming is of that order. What does dangerous climate change mean? You wait to people who can visualize. You go, that's where you go. And then Kant says, but all these 3 questions, what is the problem? What can we do about it? And what do we expect from it? He was also saying that all these 3 questions eventually fold back into a big question, which is, what is the human being? And really the question I was asking myself as a humanist is, what is the human being today once we have understood about climate change, planetary climate change? So in a way, I wrote a book which is an engagement with Earth system science, but not with a view to either defining the problem. I think they define the problem, not with a view to solving the problem. I think you go to other people, but with a view to thinking what it does to our sense of human history and what it does to what Hannah Arendt called once the human condition. Because I think the human condition has fundamentally changed. So with that in mind, so let me begin with what is peculiar to Earth system science. What is peculiar to Earth system science is that it speaks of the climate system of the whole planet. It sees this climate as a kind of connected body. And so it doesn't speak of weather. I mean, it does speak of weather in particular places, but actually fundamentally it is a science that is trying to think of this climate system of the whole planet. So what does it mean for humanists to engage with Earth system science? Does it mean that we simply add to our repertoire of existing analytical tools in the social and human sciences without those tools being affected by the science in any way? I mean, do we simply add these Earth system science, I'll call it ESS tools? Would not the encounter with deep history, geobiological deep time, which is intrinsic to Earth system thinking, also change or challenge the shallow time of history that humanist scholars work with? And recently, of course, as I was asking this question as a historian, 2 social scientists based in England, Nigel Clark, who is a geographer, and a sociologist, Bronislaw Szerzyński, have also raised this question with regard to social thought in general, a project they describe as a project of geologizing the social and socializing the Anthropocene. My initial foray into this problem, into the 2 questions I raised, this was in 2009, produced a multitude of reactions, ranging from some very hostile ones from scholars on the left, who thought that all human social planetary problems had their origins in social and economic inequalities, to more nuanced, welcoming, generous, but sometimes critical, nevertheless critical, responses from scholars such as Ian Bauckham, who wrote a book called History Degree 4. And the question I was often asked at lectures and conferences was about the relationship between my work on provincializing Europe and my new work on climate change. And the question kept, I did not immediately have an answer to it, to be honest with you. I knew that I was interested in climate change. I knew that I was interested in provincializing Europe. I didn't know how to bring the two together, and people were asking me. So it also meant that I kept thinking about that problem as I worked on climate change more. So in a way, these questions and criticisms shaped my work on climate change. There was no, it was an uncharted territory for me as a humanist. So as people criticized me, as I wrote, people criticized me, I realized some of my own mistakes. I realized some of their misreadings. I answered their misreadings, and that's how the work developed. So in that way, I'm very grateful even to the hostile critics, because without the pressure of their thoughts, my own thoughts wouldn't have developed, even if it developed in disagreement. So, but as I worked through the problems, I'd set myself in comprehending global warming and the Anthropocene hypothesis, the idea that the planet has crossed the threshold of the geological epoch of the Holocene, thanks to human impact on the planet, and had entered a new epoch for which the name Anthropocene was proposed, a much debated name. I ended up positing an analytical distinction between the globe and the planet as categories with distinctly different inputs for humanist thought. And I argued that this distinction between the globe and the planet issued from my encounter with the deep time of the Earth system. So by Earth system, very briefly, what they refer to is the way geology and biology have interacted in the history of our planet to create a life-supporting system. And it has supported multicellular complex life for almost 500 million years. And that is the system we now say is under threat with climate change. So this coming together of geology and biology, sometimes referred to as geobiology of the planet, is really what they call the Earth system. This meant that the word globe in the expression globalization, and this was first pointed out to me by a French philosopher, Catherine Malabou, who was discussing and reading my work, that the word globe in the expression globalization and the word globe of global warming did not have the same meaning. The globe of globalization was at most a 500-year-old entity. That is, globalization of the world is really a result of initial European expansion, European empire building, and eventually the development of technology. So this was a 500-year-old world brought into being, or globe brought into being by humans, and their technologies mainly of transport, communication, but also medicine. It was a human-told story with humans at its center. The globe of global warming referred to what Earth system scientists call the Earth system. Now, this was a heuristic, kind of a model-like construct of Earth system scholars, and it referred to planetary processes whereby, as I said, geological and biological factors combine to support life. The story of the Earth system is also a human-told story. It's not a story that the Earth tells, but it does not have humans at its center, because disciplines like geology and evolutionary biology, which tells us the history of life, cannot be anthropocentric, for humans come too late in the stories they tell to be at the center of their narratives. So this Earth, what the scientists called Earth system, is what I would eventually regard as the planet. And the first hint that I got was that this is a humanist category, was actually reading the Earth system scientists themselves. Because in their scientific books, where they would give you the history of the Earth system, how the Earth lurches from one state to another state, and as they brought that history up to the present state, our present environmental crisis, the scientists themselves then would express worry, would express anxiety, would express affect. They would, their scientific narratives would not simply be contained within a scientific disinterestedness. And I realized that they themselves were worried about human existence through the science of the Earth system that they were discovering and talking about. And therefore, you could not separate their citizenly, humanistic, political self from their scientific self totally. And reading that, I realized that it's within their own attitudes that there is a certain kind of humanism, there is a certain kind of concern, which only can be thought about in a philosophical register or some sort of existential register. And it also made me realize that all discussions of planetary governance, global governance, are also existential questions, discussing existential questions. That sort of behind that are questions like, will this civilization exist, continue to exist? Will humans continue to exist? As you know, when Martin Rees, who was a physicist, astrophysicist, was the president of the Royal Society in England, wrote a book about 10 years ago, trying to argue that humans will go extinct in 100 years or so. I mean, it was an overstatement, but you can see the level of concern, the level of anxiety, the affect that was being produced in the scientists themselves by the science. So it is the Earth system that I was calling the planet. I also argued, and this is where I often get misread, I also argued that it was the intensification of the capitalist and technology-driven process of globalization in the late 20th century that brought within the ambit of humanist thought and the domain of everyday news, the news of the planetary, hitherto of interest only to specialist scientists. I wrote, I'm quoting, the intensification of globalization and the consequent crisis of global warming, along with all the debates that have attended the studies of this phenomena, have ensured that the planet, or more properly the Earth system, has swum into our ken, even across the intellectual horizons of scholars in the humanities. And then again, I wrote, using Heidegger's language, one can say that the harder we work the Earth, and Heidegger made an interesting distinction between the Earth and the planet. The harder we work the Earth in our increasing quest for profit and power, the more we encounter the planet. The planet emerged from the project of globalization. To avoid a common misunderstanding of my work, however, I should point out that it should be obvious by now that I did not ever suggest that the globe and the planet constituted anything like a mutually exclusive binary. Some inattentive readers have attributed that view to me, but it is not what I said. In my thinking, the globe and the planet have always been related entities. And I may refer you to my book that's coming out in April in German for an extended elaboration of the distinction as a way of reconceptualizing human history. But it may suffice to quote here some relevant sentences from that book, because this analytical and not a binary distinction is still functioned as the starting point of the thinking that actually unfolds in my book. So here are some quick excerpts to reinforce the point I just made. The globe and the planet, and I'm quoting myself, as categories standing for the two narratives of globalization and global warming, are connected. What connects them are the phenomena of modern capitalism, using the term loosely, and technology, both global in their reach. A key moment along that path of discovery came for me when I stumbled on the realization that the concept of globe in the word globalization was not the same as the concept of globe in the expression global warming. Same words, but their reference were different. This is the idea I would eventually come to develop as the globe-planet distinction, not a binary, I wrote, I wish to stress, but two related term distinguished analytically. I found the globe-planet distinction useful in that they provided two different but related vantage points from which to develop simultaneously two different perspectives of human history. And those perspectives tell us something about the human condition and how it's changed. We need to work with both of these in writing humanist histories for our age. Humans remain and will remain divided on the question of how to relate to what I've called the planets. But in the age of anthropomorphic climate change, the planet has emerged as a matter of concern in that Heideggerian sense. I list below some of the major differences that distinguish the Earth system, or the planet in my terms, of ESS from the globe of globalization. And once again, please remember the distinctions are of analytical value. The globe and the planet are connected. So what I'll do at this stage is just share the screen and show you some slides. Tell me if it's working.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Good. So as I said, the first is global is human-made. It involves the work of empires, capitalism, and technology. Humans are at the center of the story, the main protagonist of the story of the making of the globe. The planet, also a human construct, decenters the human. Humans come too late in the geological and biological histories of the planet to be at the center of those stories. The category planet has built into it the stance, for instance, philosophically, when we speak of category planet, it has built into it the stance that the planet would have been 4.5 billion years old, even if there were no humans to count its age. Second, the global belongs to the recorded history of 500 years. The planetary is about deep history, the geobiological history of the planet. The global is uniquely and singularly human. The planet is comparative, emerging out of human attempts to answer questions such as the following. Can Mars be made habitable for complex life? Did Venus become hot because it experienced runaway planetary warming? Technology becomes a planetary question when we ask, for instance, can the Earth's climate be engineered by humans? Or much more far-fetchedly, is a high-tech civilization necessarily unsustainable? Does it abort itself? Fourth, sustainability is a global and humanocentric term. It asks if humans could leave the Earth in a sustainable state for humans who come after them. The planetary is about habitability, an issue that is raised, for instance, when we ask, how does the planet become habitable for life? So it relates not only to human life, but to life in general. Here, life does not refer exclusively to life in the human form. The global is about a human dominant order of life on this planet. The geobiological history of the planet, on the other hand, makes us realize that we are a minority form of life, and that the majority forms of life on the planet, both by weight and numbers, are microbial: bacteria, viruses, protists, fungi, etc. In human terms, the situation calls on us to develop minoritarian forms of thinking with regard to other forms of life. And I should mention here the point that there's a lot of anti-science talk in the climate literature, particularly sometimes from the radical left, who think the science is Western. Some people call it white science. But honestly, without whether you call it Western science, white science, whatever, without science, we wouldn't even know about the microbes because they're not visible or perceptible to human organs of perception. 6, the globe, the earth, and the world are all categories, all assume a relationship of mutuality between humans and their worldly environment. We express this, for example, when we say, the earth is our home. It is made so that we can dwell on it. The planet is different in its relationship to us. We are not the end that the primary planetary processes that support life have in view. Humans are a product of contingencies in the history of life on the planet. The planet, in that sense, does not return our gaze, in that we cannot assume any relationship of mutuality or reciprocity that we, for example, imply when we use words like world or earth. You know, I mean, one example I give often is the share of oxygen in the atmosphere, on which we depend very critically. Because if the share went up, things would go up in flames. If the share went down, they will choke to death. But the planet or Earth system has maintained that share. It's now 21%, roughly in that zone for almost 400 million years. So one could argue that we can't live without this air. But the air was not necessarily made with us in view. That's what I mean by non-mutuality. The globe, forged by human technology, lends itself to moral and therefore political questions. It is amenable to issues of fairness and forms. Planetary forces, on the other hand, can reduce us to our creaturely lives. So one example I give in the book is the firestorms in Australia in 2021, year and a half ago, or about 2 years, when, for instance, the government of South Australia decided to kill 10,000 feral camels, because the camels were competing with human beings for water. So when you're faced with planetary fury, human politics becomes politics of survival. It becomes the same as whatever any animal would do. It would want to survive. And so when we're faced with planetary fury, such as a tsunami, an earthquake, a firestorm, all of which could be triggered by our interference with the Earth system, our politics is reduced to the politics of survival. Something that can't or aren't would not call politics at all, for it is bereft of any sense of morality. So I'll skip the 8th point on the screen and I'll stop sharing. What happened? Okay, so the category planet, as I've used and explained it here, poses a peculiar challenge to what humans regard as the domain of the political, a heterotropic area that includes a range of activities, from those issuing from the nation-state form to other forms of power and inequality down to the individual human. The problem is this: the planet, that is the Earth system, is both differentiated and unitary. It is a dynamic ensemble of relationships I wrote in my book. It lurches from one state to another in geological time. Nigel Clark and Bronislaw Szerzyński, whom I mentioned, they observe that the Earth is more than a single system that supports life. There are decouplings and disconnections in the planetary body as well as couplings. They introduce the idea of planetary multiplicities, by which they refer to the undeniable fact that the Earth has an inherent potential to shift from one state to another and do so quickly. This idea of tipping points is very common in the geological history of the Earth. But they also acknowledge the oneness of this planet and see it, I'm quoting, as a dynamic and self-organized entity. In its differentiated representation, the planet or the Earth system speaks of the different entanglements of the geological with the biological, of different forms of life with one another, connecting the work of bacteria and planktons, for instance, to the proportion of oxygen in the air. Such entanglements are subjects on which Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, Bruno Latour, and others have written with insight and imagination. Entanglements represent the differentiated aspect of the planet. Yet the planet is also one. The carbon budgets for humanity that the IPCC publishes from time to time, that can be treated as a whole, and a single Earth system supporting life. So it assumes that. It is significant that the science of all this is called Earth system in the singular science, not Earth system science. The definition provided by the International Biosphere Geosphere Program emphasizes the singular nature of the system. This is not to deny that there could not be many other understandings and representations of the planet than that proposed by Earth system science. Indian astrologers, for instance, could have had an entirely different set of reasons explaining the planetary plight of humans. But the IPCC recommendations regarding carbon budgets for the atmosphere of the planet could only be made on the assumption that the planet is at once differentiated and yet one. Humans, on the other hand, are only differentiated. That is not one. Politically speaking, there is no one humanity in politics. Politics stems from what differentiates humans. That which may be a universal truth about human, that they are a biological species entangled with other forms of life, for instance, constitutes no ground from which a unitary political subject could arise and project itself onto the world. As Sartre, following a train of thought that went back to Hegel, once pointed out in his preface to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, the recognition of one human by another as a human being may very well be the ground for the production of hierarchy and difference, of colonization, torture, oppression, dispossession, and enslavement. I mean, you don't do to animals these things that you do to humans because you recognize them as humans. The IPCC may posit one planet and issue calls for somewhat synchronized human action based on a unitary planetary calendar. But humans and their representative institutions would always want to root this oneness, or route, as my American colleagues would say, this oneness through their differences. Thus, when nations like India say to the industrialized nations that they, the industrialized nations should, they, meaning countries like India, should be allowed some carbon space for development, as the warming of the planet is the historical responsibility of the richer countries, they not only, that is, Indians not only raise an important point of climate justice, they also by the same move differentiate the planet. It is like saying to the developed nations, the planet is mainly yours for the next 2 or 3 decades. Looking after it is also mainly your business. We need to focus predominantly on growth for the time being. That is an act of splitting the planet. And that's what human politics does. This structural and unresolvable mismatch between the oneness of the Earth system, as imagined by the science of climate change, and the pluriversal quality of human politics, defines, to my mind, a fundamental aspect of the human condition today. The science itself is a product of the differentiated nature of humanity. It is a product of the divisions of the Cold War. The Cold War produced atmospheric science and comparative planetary science in a big way. Nuclear fallout, weaponization of weather, colonizing Mars and other heavenly bodies became security concerns of the superpower nations. The technology of space exploration, after all, came out of the Cold War, and the growing weaponization of atmosphere and space that eventually created Earth system science in the 1980s in the United States. The connection may be even seen in the fact that climate scientists would not have been able to bore into ice of 800,000 years ago if the US defense establishment and the much denounced oil and mining companies had not developed the necessary technology for drilling. that was then modified to deal with ice. Whether we are in the Anthropocene or not, the scientific exploration of the condition of global warming allows scientists to construct, through use of satellite measurements, drilling into polar ice caps, oceanic measurements, a hyperobject, in Tim Morton's terms, called the Earth system. It is this that I've called the planet. It is an abstract scientific construct that is meant to explain how this planet, where geology and biology have long been connected phenomena, has a life support system that works as just that, a system. Planetary processes, including the work done by phytoplankton, for instance, maintain a certain measure of oxygen in the atmosphere, as I mentioned, at levels that are helpful for the survival of animals, including humans and plants. This atmosphere is critical for our existence, but it was not made with humans in view. The planet has maintained this atmosphere for, they say, 375 million years, if they call it the modern atmosphere of the planet. To place the origins of the Earth system science in the context of the Cold War is to historicize the science, but it does not detract from the knowledge the science has come to embody. Our awareness of this planetary condition of human politics could only have come about as the increasing frequency and impact of extreme weather events across the world sensitized us to the messages the IPCC had been broadcasting for a while. Provincializing Europe spoke, in my judgment, very well to the problem of the global. But it was unaware, as were most post-colonial critics and theorists of that time, of the planetary, as I use the word planetary. As I write this sentence, I'm reminded of Ian Baucom's thoughtful, attentive, gracious, and yet sharp qualities hard to find in criticism these days. Critique of my climate-related writings in his book, History 4 Degrees Celsius, where he argues, the book came out last year, where he argues, rescuing me from myself, as it were, that there are indeed resources in provincializing Europe that may still be of use in conceptualizing the geological agency of humans. He may or may not be right, or there might be some middle ground between our positions. Let me, for now, reserve judgment on that question, but I would still submit that the problem of the planet, as I think of it, that is, the planet is the Earth system, does not emerge in Baucom's book, dependent as it is partially on Paul Gilroy's use of the word in the expression planetary humanism, where the planet remains coextensive in time and space with humanity, whereas my Earth system is at least 500 million years old, so it can't be coextensive with humans. My use of the word planet refers to the Earth system, as I said, something that has been in existence for hundreds of millions of years. This planet does not index humans or even human experience. Many human understandings of the planet are based on direct observation, even through telescopes, or human experience. But the Earth system refers to the work that is done by deep oceans, for instance, glacier systems, for instance, places where humans don't live. The role that these entities play in the management of the climate system. So that's why I say that the planet does not index humans. It is impossible to run its entire history to the history of human existence. What I mean by the planetary is perhaps more in congruence with some of the post-colonial thinker Achille Mbembe, the South African thinker, his statements in his essay called Decolonizing Knowledge and the Question of Archive, where Achille Mbembe writes, humans are part of a very long, deep history that is simply not theirs. That sentence captures the spirit of what it is. Humans are part of a very long, deep history that is not just theirs. That history is vastly older than the very existence of human race, which in fact is very recent. So the sentence is saying we are part of a long history which was unfolding even before we evolved. And that long, deep history is still part of our history. So it is within us, but it is not just our history in the way in which the global is part of our history. Saying this, however, does not mean that the concerns of provincializing Europe are no longer relevant today, when humans find themselves situated on the cusp of the global and the planet. So, so what I've then talked about is what you might think of as the one and the many problem of climate change. The one and the many is a famous theological problem, but you might say that the climate change also has a one and the many problem, one planet, many worlds. To repeat, Earth system sign posits one Earth system. They use the word in singular. There is, however, no corresponding single humanity that is either responsible for the warming or can act as one in combating it. The IPCC's talk about there being a climate emergency clearly has a temporal dimension. Emergency connotes a sense of time when urgent action is needed. But the time in question is planetary time. The time it will take to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it is based on the assumption that the planet, with its atmosphere and the seas, is one. Humanity, however, is not one, both in post-colonial and decolonial modes of thinking. The political times of humans is based on an assumption of difference, intrahuman difference. How does an agent that is not one deal with the problem of the one, except by trying to convert that one also into a not one? This mismatch produces a sense of disorienting times that Francois Hartog, Bruno Latour, and others have commented on. How to produce an urgent response to planetary emergency while negotiating human differences on the ground becomes the most critical political task of the day. I'm now moving towards the end of my lecture. Human differences in the end are existential. They are a fact of life. We are different as individuals. We are born different from one another, a fact in which Hannah Arendt saw grounds for hope and the basis for the political. During his deliberations on justice, equality, and proportionality in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle focused on the problem of exchange. Exchange was central to the question of forming a community that was always made up of people who were necessarily different and unequal. And I'm quoting Aristotle, for it is not two doctors who associate for exchange, but a doctor and a farmer, or in general, people who are different and unequal. These must somehow be equated, must somehow be made commensurable to have the problem of justice, to have the problem of politics, that is. On the ground, then, there's only difference. The task of politics is to find solidarities across these differences, sublating, articulating, or even suspending them for a while. But how long is the while, and how long does it take to get there? Issues of temporality are fundamental aspects of human politics. Politics is framed by a sense of community that, to speak with Derrida, is always to come. This constitutional feature of politics now itself emerges as a political problem. If some humans declare a climate emergency, in other words, IPCC has no political authority, but if some humans take on themselves the political authority to declare a climate emergency, then that declaration itself becomes a political problem. Should some powerful nations bypass the difficult politics of difference and launch into climate engineering? Or should humans patiently work through their differences, even if that means that they miss the schedule of a planetary calendar of action that the IPCC recommends? Or should humans, finding themselves entangled in other forms of life, stay actively and not passively with the trouble, as Donna Haraway puts it, and work towards recomposing the commons? But what would be the political commons between microbes constituting a majority forms of life and humans, a dominant minority, look like? We don't know. I do not have a grand solution to these questions. They are some of the larger and urgent political questions of our time. But I do suggest that for everything I've studied, that the political may indeed be something that, as of now, remains parochially and provincially human. the facts of human entanglement in other forms of life are visible, as much at the planetary level in the history of the Earth system, as in the story of the current pandemic that affects us collectively and personally. I mean, the pandemic reminds us every day of the presence of viruses inside and outside our bodies. But these entanglements, while real, do not constitute in themselves political subjects. While it is possible for humans to act as their advocates, faced with the cascade of events or problems that we call anthropogenic climate change, both humans and non-humans will act. Trees, animals, birds, bees, fish, and other creatures and microbes will all move. For instance, to sites and areas more congenial to their flourishing. That's what has happened in the past when we find evidence of global warming on this planet, like the warming that happened over 55 million years ago, when the planet warmed up by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. But it was slow warming. It happened over 10,000 years. And when people go back and look for the fossil remains of that era, they see animals moving. So faced with the crisis, everything will move, all living things will move. But the proactive question, the political question, Lenin's question, what is to be done, is still for humans alone. And my only submission is that grasping the analytical distinction between the globe and the planet may give us a handle on this historical experience of disorientation. So if someone were to ask me today, what do I provincialize in my climate-related work, I would probably say that I provincialize the human and do so as a humanist historian of human beings. Thank you. So I think I was short of my...
Thank you, Dipesh. Thank you very much for this.
I'm close to my, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You really addressed many criticisms of the last years, and I think contributed to more clarity here. Miranda now will comment first, followed directly by Nicki, and then you will have the opportunity to shortly respond before we open the discussion for all afterwards. So Miranda, thank you for your comment. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Our connection has been a little bit on the bad side this whole time, so I hope that you're all okay. You can hear me okay.
I can hear you very well, yeah.
Okay, so it could be that the connection problem is more on your end. Thanks very much for your presentation and for your book. I very much enjoyed reading it and listening to your presentation. And I should let you know that this room that you're talking to is a combination of students who are engineers, social scientists, a few philosophers. And so we have a very different mix of people here with a very different kind of vocabulary. So I'm guessing that your vocabulary may have some of our engineers a little bit uncertain. I'm going to try to, try to connect a little bit more to the engineers in the room, and two, address a little bit your argumentation. So if I translate your argumentation, I would say one way you can say it fairly simply is to say we have a planet that's been around for billions of years, and humans have been on it for a very short time. And in the billion years, we're talking 4.5 billion years of planet, perhaps for, you say 500 million years, some would argue even longer, 1.5, some even argue more than that, billion years, there has been signs of life on the planet, different kinds of cellular forms with different levels of complexity. and that we as humans have been a civilized, whatever that means, part of this planet for a few thousand years. Although humans and their near relatives have been around for maybe a couple of million years, but in geological time, we've hardly been there. So we really are, you said this in your book, guests on the planet. And the planet doesn't really remember us historically. We're not even a dot in the spectrum of time. And yet we have an anthropocentric view of the world, meaning we put the humans at the center of our understanding of the planet and what you call the globe. So we have a historical time where we focus on this civilization, and particularly the last 500 years, you're arguing is relatively important for understanding this thing called climate change, anthropogenic climate change. I can remember the first time I heard that word, the anthropogenic climate change. Like, what are they talking about? And for those of you who aren't so familiar with it, it means nothing more than the human-induced parts of climate change, because climate change is part of a natural system. What I find very interesting in your argumentation is that you're saying we in this industrial age, and you're actually problematizing the we, but we in the industrial age have managed to do something that was not ever done before. A particular species has managed to impact on that natural climate system. And so we have become interconnected into a climate system that in the past, we were probably still interconnected, but not really impacting. And what I hear you saying is that as a human-centered world, the globus, we are not all of the same mind as to who has caused this problem. And that as a result, we have the focus on things like colonialism. You rich guys caused the problem, give us a chance to develop. And that means that we have levels of complexity here that make it really difficult for us to deal with this problem, because it actually is a problem that requires common thinking, common action, but that respects the diversity we have in our societies, and the reality that there was colonialism, and the reality that the world is not just, and that 80% of these greenhouse gas emissions have been caused by a small percentage of the people on the planet. And that therefore impacts the whole question of how we deal with it. And that there's no single solution, if I'm hearing you correctly. We can't just say we need to step out of the use of fossil fuels and coal and expect a unified answer on this, that we need some more diverse thinking about how we react to the problem. And what I particularly heard you saying is, be careful, climate engineering could be a big problem. When you come in and you try to geoengineer the problem, that would be somebody coming in from the outside and saying, okay, we're going to take missiles, put particles into the atmosphere, and therefore we'll solve the problem our way. I agree very much with a lot of it. There are areas where I, as someone who am more tied into the climate science and also into the solution side, would like to hear a bit more. So one is the whole question of the argumentation around fossil fuels and coal, because it's clear that in the phase of human development of the last 500 years, coal has been central, and it's helped us to get where we are in this thing called modernization, which you also problematize, basically saying what really is modernization here. But you also argue that we continue this way because coal is cheap. And actually, I think one of the really interesting developments of late has been a challenge to this dominant understanding of development. And this challenge to the dominant understanding is that there are alternatives to fossil fuels. You also problematize that a little bit in your book. You're saying, you know, there's one school of thought that thinks an awful lot about, okay, renewable energy, if we do that, that's the answer. But what I think it does do is it takes us away from this kind of capitalism you've been talking about, which is a very centralized capitalism, where the firms that dominate and have dominated since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution have in fact been able to dominate because they have a very centralized mode of energy production, and that alternatives can allow for a democratization of energy, a democratization of production, and also a differentiation. So one question I have for you there is a little bit, how do we deal with what is actually a reality now? The solutions we're looking at outside of the geoengineering solutions, that is, are actually pretty diverse. So we're looking at various kinds of renewable energy, and we're looking at planting trees, and we're looking at reducing wasteful consumption, and we're looking at using digital technologies to improve efficiencies. So one question I have for you there is, how do we think about these solutions in your argumentation? I would also like to ask you a little bit about the discussion you have on colonialism. It awakens in me a lot of memories of what I've seen in the negotiations. In the international negotiations, what I very often hear from developing countries, earlier from China, now very much from India, is we're not historically responsible for climate change. Therefore, we need financial assistance, technological assistance, and don't expect that we can do very much yet. You guys in the North need to take primary responsibility. There's a lot of truth to that in my mind. You throw in the point about population, however, and you focus on the reality that population is growing very much in many of those countries that were the former colonial countries, the colonized countries. And so I was left a little bit uncertain what you wanted to tell us here. What's the element here related to population growth and the dominant population as a species? And the question of how do we deal with these differences between culturally, historically dominant North and the developing South that has not been able to write history or shape history, in part because we never let the colonized countries have a voice. So maybe you can say a few more words about that as well. But what I do very much like in your work is you're also saying, in the end, what we're really missing is respect. Respect for this planet that we are very much a part of, and that without that respect, we are too likely to continue along a path that is bringing us closer and closer to a point where maybe our species won't go extinct right away, but where it could go extinct, or where certainly an awful large part of the population could be very heavily impacted. So those are a few initial thoughts, and thanks again for your presentation.
Should I respond to it, Martin? To
I think we should take Nicki's and Christina's comment first, and then you can respond to both.
Sure, okay. Sure.
Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah, thank you, all of you. And Dipesh, just to make it clear, my commentary is more a reflection on our readings of your book, because in my opinion, you clarified a lot of questions that we were also thinking about in the last days, even after our interview. So just to put this into context. So thank you very much for the information today and your lecture. I will just read our commentary because it's a little bit easier for me. One can understand Dipesh's new book as a present invitation to question our perspectives on the challenges of climate change. To do so, Dipesh reminds us that we need to reconsider the basic understandings of our condition as humans. Following his approach, climate change cannot purely be met through our everyday practices as citizens and our democratic policies. Instead, Dipesh suggests distinguishing between the globe and the planetary. We need to shift our perspective towards the planetary, since it allows us to see what is made unseen by the global perspective. Global history is made by humans. It centers the human and surrounds it with the non-human. We understand humans as rational agents. We think we can calculate the effects of our capitalist form of life and control our desires. We do recognize the harm we keep on doing to the planet. Still, we also realize the limits of our regional approaches. We seem to be stuck with our created structures, but accept them as given. Shifting to the planetary helps us put the harm we're doing to our surroundings into context. From a planetary perspective, we can see the immense geophysical force humans have evolved to become within the Anthropocene. The planetary decenters the human. In planetary history, the human comes late, as Dipesh writes in his book. Still, our consuming way of living determines the climate and all life on Earth, human and non-human. This distinction between human and non-human is reflected in different temporalities: deep time, in which the planetary resides, and historical time, which is our human scale. Bridging these two modes becomes the main challenge in facing the planetary. Reconsidering the basic understandings of our conditions as humans also means asking ourselves what Dipesh's planetary approach means for our field of expertise. Who counts as human? Since Frantz Fanon, the question has been at the center of postcolonial theories. Fanon's work aims at a new understanding of the human to an account that liberates the Eurocentric taxonomy of being human, since it's interwoven in imperialism and colonial rule. In his book, Dipesh criticizes the focus on what divides us and the skepticism towards universalities in postcolonial thought. He says it made postcolonials blind to the challenges of environmental and climate justice. Taking Dipesh's thesis seriously would mean conceptualizing a humanism that decenters the human and takes all life into account. This more than human account would still be a task for the humanities, since academic institutions enforce a logocentric approach to knowledge. This opens the question whether the human is even able to grasp deep historical time beyond scientific facts, against the backdrop of the modernist tendency to provide certainty. In that sense, modernity has profoundly contributed, if not created, the affective and mental limitations of the human to decenter himself and foster a planetary perspective. Dipesh, towards the end of the book, identifies modernity's role in the loss of a human reference, which may be linked to these potential limits of cognitive, rational scientific knowledge and the need for a deeper transformation of what is meant to be human. In other words, a planetary perspective might entail not only an epistemological shift of perspective, but also an ontological one. The post-colonial critique of colonial and racial continuities has not become less important, but Dipesh reminds us that it must be implanted into a larger context. Fanon's famous outcry reminds us to constantly reflect on our understandings of being human. Oh, my body, make of me always a man who asks who questions. Or I respectfully correct Fanon and say a human who asks questions. For Fanon, his body continually reminds him that there's always something outside the symbolic order. The German philosopher Karl Jaspers said that the idea of the human is brought to the world by something he is not. Following the existentialism of Fanon and Jaspers, one could say that our body connects us to the something we are not, the non-human. It reminds us of the necessity of the non-human for our being as embodied minds. Centering our body in our thoughts means decentering the human towards a planetary perspective. Destroying the planet through our geophysical force destroys our material basis. To stay human or to become human means recognizing that we are primarily nothing but complex multicellular life, just like the planet itself. Therefore, the task of Fanon's revolutionary humanism today would be politically linking both, caring for those who are not yet accounted as human and caring for the non-human since it's fundamental for our being. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicki and Christina. Now, while Dipesh has the opportunity to respond to those two brilliant comments, I invite all others of you to raise your digital hands. I will make a list, and after your response, Dipesh, we will get straight into the discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Nicki.
No, sorry. So it's now your time, Dipesh, to respond to Miranda and
Christina speaking.
No, that was a combined commentary from both of us. So to make
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Christina. Look, I thank you both, and thank you, Miranda, again for their comments. So maybe I'll just to clarify, I'll go back to some slides again, and I assume that most of you would be familiar with the Great Acceleration slides, but I'll just show them to just speak of the history that we were talking about. So I'll share screen. Okay, let me get the slides up. Okay, I'll have to get another set of slides up. Just give me 1 minute. I'll get sorry, I'm just trying to find the right set of slides to show you. Yeah, that'll do. Okay, good. So I'm sharing screen. I'm going to my slides. Share. And
yes, that's
enlarging it.
Great.
Okay, good. So these are called the Great Acceleration graphs. Many of you would be familiar with them, but I think it'll. I'm using them partly to respond to some of the things that Miranda pointed out in terms of years when actually this carbon emission happens. So if you look at these graphs, you will see that it's really after 1950 that everything expands exponentially. So whether you're, in fact, I read somewhere that of all the fossil fuel consumed by human beings, 87% of that consumption happened after 1950. So when you look at these, so 1950 is the line when things go really up. Population expands in India and China, and then it's been controlled. Indian population growth rate is going down. The place where population is expected to increase still is Africa. Most of the new countries mentioned are in Africa. And it's also expected that the population will stabilize and eventually go down by by its natural historical causes. In the same way, I mean, if you forgot climate change, just as what happened with Europe, as countries became developed, the cost of child rearing increased, child mortality decreased, people began to have fewer families, and women became educated. So there are reasons for expecting that the population growth will not carry on indefinitely. So these break them down into BRIC countries and OECD countries, and you will see that after 1950, most of the growth initially was in the OECD post-war reconstruction, and then eventually from the 1980s, 90s into China, India, and other places. Something you also have to take into account is that has played a very important role, and this is where science is very, very important, is the invention of antibiotics in the 1930s. And antibiotics saved a lot of life during the war, and has saved life since, except that, when we now talk about antibiotic resistant bacteria in the hospitals, and in some cases, doctors themselves say that it now takes 10 times the amount of penicillin it would have taken during the war to fix some of the infections. This battle between human technology and bacteria and virus, this is an ongoing battle. And the biologist once said that if you could write a thriller about this human battle with microbes, and you would have to call it their genes versus our intelligence, or something like that. Okay? It's an ongoing battle. And you see the planetary processes. So it's not just the humans expand, have a good life. There's a psychologist at Harvard, very well known, called Steven Pinker, who has a book called Enlightenment Now, and who argues that humans have been living better and better and better, and we're moving to a better world, except that he doesn't think seriously about climate. But actually, all his graphs are graphs of great acceleration. But you also, then you look at the surface temperature, ocean acidification. Basically, that's the ozone layer is the depletion of the ozone layer, stratospheric ozone. You basically see that all these earthly processes, planetary processes, also become exponentially, they grow exponentially from the 1950 on, the same line. Right? So it's really, the critical years are post-war. See, human population is about 1.6 billion in 1900. It becomes 6 billion in 2000. And even a lot of that growth there's a bump after the Second World War. So in my lifetime, India has grown population more than 4 times. Urban population has grown even more at a higher rate. And then, so that's why really it's the critical years are not the 500 years, not, of course, the history of life, you're totally right, sort of goes back. It's after sort of 1 or 1.5 billion years of the planet's creation that life begins. So when I said 500 million, I was talking about multicellular, complex multicellular life. And so these are the more recent graphs that take the story up to 2020. And you will see that birth rate is declining. And that's one good news. And that actually declines through democratic. I mean, if you educate women, birth rate goes down. If women are brought into employment, and that's one area where all goals of democracy and social engineering, they work together nicely. The question I was raising, as I told you, I'm not a policy person, but just to wearing a solution hat for the moment, to go back to your question, I guess what I would say is that the IPCC calendars of action, the carbon budget's calendar of action, are very difficult to keep to. But if the science is true, then it means that if you can't keep to the calendar of action based on carbon budgets, then there'll be a lot of extreme weather disasters. And there needs to be a lot of resources given by the rich countries to the poor countries for mitigation and adaptation. As to the change from, I agree with you that the renewables are becoming cheaper, but when you look at the science and technology departments and the way they do research. In my university, there's a huge amount of money now getting spent in the development of lithium batteries for storing energy, because both solar and wind have this intermittency problem. The sun is not always up, the wind is not always blowing. But if I speak to my colleagues who are developing technologies from lithium, for lithium batteries, they have no professional interest in understanding where lithium comes from and what is the politics of mining lithium. So what happens is that at the level of technology engineering, things get very siloed, because that's how research develops, by developing specialization. And as a humanist, I was trying to take a more holistic view of the problem. And that's why I'm saying that I'm not specially skilled to offer solutions. You are much more specially skilled. But it seems to me that what if we recognize democracy, recognize inequality, recognize justice, it's very hard to deal with Earth system science's assumption of the oneness of the planet. We deal with it by making it not one, by as I was saying, that you split the planet by saying, okay, you guys look after it for 20 years, and then we will come into action, or something like that. So I would say that if we don't do unilateral geoengineering, climate engineering, things like that, then we really need to talk about how to protect the poor of the world from things that will follow if we can't follow the carbon budget plans of the IPCC. And going, so I'll just I'll stop sharing. I've made the points I was wanting to make. And Nicki and Christina's comments. Let me just get rid of the slides. Thank you. The one point I want to make, thank you for your comments, and I really enjoyed our discussion we had the other day as well. The one point I want to make quickly is that I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm trying to suggest that we remain humans, but in remaining human and being human, we now have to take into account the non-human, both living and non-living. And we can't do that without the sciences. I say the microbial world since the 17th century was opened up by sciences. So in that sense, I'm not an anti-science person. But at the same time, when you put them together, so there's a word that Lynn Margulis, the biologist, coined to describe the human being as not a single human being, not a single organism, but actually as this entity where you could not distinguish between the organism and its environment, like there are bacteria inside us. So she wanted to think of all of us, Nicki, you, Christina, you or me, all of us individually as a collection of living communities, not as one person. And she had a name for it. She called it the Holobiont, using Greek words, originally Greek words. She coined this word, that we're all holobionts. And I think we should be aware of being holobionts. But the holobiont cannot be a political subject. And that's why I keep saying that we are very alone in being political. And that's why we are, in Nietzsche's term, being political is all too human in that sense. Or in my terms, it's very provincially human or parochially human act to be political. We have to be political. How we become human, how we think of ourselves as human changes in terms of what I'm saying. And I agree with you there. But I would still say that the holobiont, at least as of now, doesn't become a political subject. We don't know how to translate that into political subjects. Whereas we still have to negotiate with IPCC, we still have to negotiate with UN, we have to negotiate with World Bank, right? And these are all humanocentric institutions that work on an assumption of abstraction of the human from the holobiont nature of the human. But now we know that we are living communities. So at least that knowledge should have some impact on what we do still as humans. That's all I would say. Yeah. Thank you very much.